In the heart of Mississippi in 1852, where cotton fields grew taller than a free man's dreams and stretched farther than any hope allowed to the enslaved, the Mississippi River carried more secrets and sorrows than it did clear water. In this troubled land, there exists a story that official records never dared to document. Bellwood Plantation, with its grand white columns and endless acres of cotton swaying like a pale ocean, became the stage for what newspapers of the time cautiously described as an unexplained inferno. A night of celebration transformed into a night of horror as the plantation's great house was reduced to glowing embers and ash. In a single winter evening, an entire family and their esteemed guests were consumed by flames, their final cries swallowed by darkness and smoke. Witnesses in distant fields spoke of firelight turning the night sky blood, orange and black, the flames leaping so high they seemed to set the stars themselves ablaze. Some swore they saw shadows flailing within the inferno, shapes that looked less like people and more like tormented spirits dancing in the blaze. What the papers didn't dare print was that this fire was no act of God or tragic accident. The truth lay in the scarred hands of a man who had lost everything, a man who discovered that the only thing more powerful than his grief was his fury. This is the story of Ezekiel, an enslaved man who turned oppression into vengeance, who transformed barrels of lamp oil and the timber of a mansion into a weapon of retribution. A man who chose a name for himself only after deciding he would never again live as someone else's property. The night the river ran black became a legend whispered across the South, a night when justice came cloaked in fire and ash, riding on the wind for all to see. Before we continue, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from, and let us know if this is your first time on our channel. And if you're enjoying this journey into a forgotten piece of history, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We have many more dark and hidden stories that history preferred to forget, and you won't want to miss them. Life at Bellwood Plantation. Bellwood Plantation in those years was like a kingdom unto itself. Over 3,000 acres of rich Mississippi Delta soil stretched along the river's edge, parceled into seemingly endless rows of cotton that bloomed white under the summer sun. The estate was prosperous and proud, known not only for the quantity of its harvest, but for the grandeur of its lifestyle. At the top of this little world stood Colonel Thaddeus Caldwell, the master of Bellwood. He was a tall, imposing figure with silvering hair and a neatly trimmed beard, always dressed in immaculate white suits in summer and dark wool in winter. A veteran of some bygone war and accustomed to command, the colonel ruled Bellwood with what he considered benevolence, though that word had a different meaning to those under his power. He believed in order and discipline above all. In his eyes, slaves were children who needed firm guidance. He enforced strict rules through overseers' whips when necessary, yet he occasionally granted small favors, a jug of molasses here, an extra blanket there, proudly assuring himself that he was a just and kind patriarch. Those concessions, he believed, kept the enslaved population loyal, or at least resigned, far better than indiscriminate brutality would. But under the veneer of paternalism lay a bedrock of calculated cruelty. After all, every coin of mercy was only given to extract $1 of labor in return. Bellwood's main house was a 3-story mansion of white-painted brick and wood, with a colonnaded porch that faced the slow-rolling river. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm light onto polished hardwood floors, portraits of Caldwell ancestors gazed sternly from the walls, and fine furniture imported from New Orleans and Europe testified to the family's wealth. It was a house meant to inspire awe, even among the Mississippi planter aristocracy. And indeed, Caldwell hospitality was famous in the region: lavish Christmas balls, summer garden parties, and hunting banquets that left guests boasting for weeks. The colonel's wife, Marjorie Caldwell, a thin, nervous woman prone to headaches, took great pride in organizing these affairs to display the family's standing. Under her watch, the best silver was always laid out, and French wines flowed freely. Yet behind her polite smiles, Mistress Caldwell lived in quiet fear of her own household, a fear of disobedience, of scandal, of anything that might crack the flawless image of Southern gentility she tried to maintain. She seldom interacted directly with the slaves except to issue curt orders or criticisms via the housekeeper, but she kept a constant, anxious eye on them from a distance. Among the slaves of Bellwood, one name commanded both respect and, in some, a hint of envy: Ezekiel. In his early 30s, Ezekiel had grown up on the plantation, and through a mix of intelligence, hard work, and perhaps fate, he had risen to a unique position in the household. Officially, he was the head butler, a role that placed him in daily proximity to the masters, handling everything from polishing the colonel's boots to managing the dining room service during those famous parties. Unofficially, he was the quiet backbone of the mansion's daily life. He knew which vintage of wine the colonel preferred with game, how Mistress Caldwell liked her tea prepared with a pinch of mint to soothe her nerves, and exactly when to disappear from a room to avoid the wrath of a family argument. He carried keys to nearly every door and cabinet in the house, a symbolic burden that sometimes made him feel more chained than the field hands who toiled under the sun. Ezekiel was lean and strong from years of hauling trunks, moving furniture, and countless other tasks requiring both muscle and discretion. His skin bore the marks of his labor, the burn scar along his forearm from an accident with a hot kettle years ago, the faded lash scars across his back from an overseer's lesson when he was a teenager, and the calluses on his hands that no amount of washing could ever smooth away. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Ezekiel was his eyes, dark and attentive, they missed nothing. Whether standing like a shadow against the wall during an elegant dinner, or quietly gathering the household's mail from town, Ezekiel observed the world around him with keen perception. He had learned early that survival for a slave, especially one in the big house, often depended on anticipating a white man's whims before they were spoken. Over the years, he became a master at reading faces. A slight narrowing of Colonel Caldwell's eyes meant he was displeased with the stew. A certain tap of Mistress Caldwell's finger on the armrest signaled an oncoming complaint. The faint slur in young Master Preston Caldwell's voice warned Ezekiel it was time to quietly remove the brandy decanter before the drinking turned into something uglier. Preston Caldwell, Colonel Caldwell's eldest son, had returned to Bellwood the year before, in 1851, after 2 years spent at a fancy college in Virginia. He came home a changed man, though not in the way his father had hoped. At 23, Preston had the colonel's tall stature but without the tempering years of discipline. His hair was a sandy blonde like his mother's, his smile quick and charming in polite company, but his eyes were a cold, pale gray that never seemed to warm, even when he laughed. And Preston laughed often, usually at the expense of those weaker than him. College had taught him many things, among them how to drink fine whiskey, rack up gambling debts, and cloak cruelty in the guise of education. He fancied himself a connoisseur of games and lessons, by which he meant the inventive torments he would devise for those unable to retaliate. Ezekiel, whose duties included attending to the young master when necessary, quickly sensed the danger coiled behind Preston's genteel manners. He saw how Preston's fingers would drum impatiently whenever he was bored, a predatory rhythm. He noticed the way Preston's gaze lingered too long on the younger slave girls carrying laundry or serving tea, a gaze that undressed and devoured. And he heard the terse warnings whispered among the house slaves, "Keep the little ones out of sight when Master Preston's around." For Preston had developed a disturbing pastime since his return to Bellwood. He liked to play at enforcing hierarchy, as he put it, by tormenting those who could not fight back. A small boy failing to bow quickly enough might find his pet dog suddenly gone the next day, given away or worse. A stable hand who spilled a drop of oil on Preston's riding boots might be made to strip off his shirt and kneel in the sun, holding heavy buckets outstretched until his arms nearly broke, just for Preston's amusement. Each incident was small enough to escape the colonel's formal notice, or could be passed off as disciplinary training, but together they wove an atmosphere of quiet terror that spread through the quarters like a slow poison. Despite these dangers, Ezekiel had believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that his own family was relatively safe at Bellwood. Years ago, he had married a fellow slave named Rebecca, a warm-eyed young woman who worked in the dairy and laundry. Their small cabin sat at the far edge of the slave quarters, and in the evenings, exhausted from the day's labors, Ezekiel would find his way there by memory and the glow of lantern light, guided by the sound of Rebecca singing softly to their children. They had two: Jacob, a boy of 7 years with long limbs and an abundance of curiosity, and Sarah, 5 years old, shy and sweet, except for flashes of impish boldness that reminded Ezekiel of her grandmother. To Ezekiel, his family was everything good in a world of hardship. Rebecca's steady support and gentle humor were his anchor. Jacob's constant questions about the world, "Papa, why do the stars shine?" or "Papa, can I learn to read like you?" were a source of pride and pain, for Ezekiel had to answer as carefully as one walks through a field of snakes. And Sarah's laughter as he carved little dolls for her from corn husks could make him forget, for just a moment, every burden on his back. Crucially, Ezekiel's valued position in the house gave him a measure of protection, and by extension he hoped it protected Rebecca and the children as well. Colonel Caldwell was not blind to Ezekiel's loyalty and competence. More than once he had boasted to dinner guests that he had the finest servant in the county, and that "my Ezekiel can run this house better than a dozen ordinary men." That pride was a shield. The colonel would not readily sell Ezekiel or his family, nor mistreat them wantonly, for fear of losing such a valuable asset. Even Preston, disdainful as he might be toward any slave, largely left Ezekiel alone due to his father's explicit orders that "Zeke is too useful to be put out of commission by your antics, son." There were moments when the colonel's protection felt almost like genuine goodwill, like the time little Jacob was allowed to recover in the sick house for a week when he fell ill, or when the colonel granted Rebecca a day off work after Sarah was born. These mercies were small and infrequent, but Ezekiel clung to them,
constructing from them an illusion of security. He told himself that as long as he performed his duties flawlessly, as long as he remained indispensable, the worst tragedies that befell other slave families might spare his own. It was a comforting belief, but a fragile one, and it would shatter soon, like a porcelain vase dropped from a great height on a day that began almost like any other. The barn tragedy. The autumn of 1852 descended on Mississippi with deceptive grace. The oak and pecan furniture colmers around Bellwood blazed in hues of gold and crimson, and the air was sweet with the smell of sugarcane being pressed at a nearby mill. It was the time of harvest celebrations, of long church Sundays, and hearty stews cooked over outdoor fires. On one such morning in late October, Ezekiel rose long before the sun, as he did every day. The dawn air was cool and still. A thin mist clung to the cotton fields, weaving through the rows like a ghostly ribbon. Ezekiel had much to prepare. Colonel Caldwell had invited 2 neighboring planters for a midday discussion about cotton prices and rail shipments. It was not an official party, but any gathering at Bellwood was an occasion for the colonel to display his famed hospitality. By first light, Ezekiel had the household in motion. In the kitchen outbuilding behind the main house, the cook and her assistant stoked the iron stove to bake biscuits and pies. Silver polished the night before gleamed on the sideboard, awaiting placement on the dining table. Ezekiel moved through these preparations with focused calm, coordinating the servants with a quiet word here, a nod there. He took pride in these skills, the choreography of service, and today especially he wanted everything to be perfect. Success today would please the colonel, and he thought, keep him and his own family in the master's good graces. Shortly after sunrise, Rebecca brought Jacob and Sarah to the kitchen yard, as she occasionally did when both parents were occupied with work. The children toddled along, rubbing sleep from their eyes. 7-year-old Jacob had insisted on helping an older field hand with the chickens at dawn, and he boasted to his father that he'd collected a whole basket of eggs on his own. Little Sarah, not to be outdone, chimed in that she helped Auntie June, an elderly slave who oversaw the henhouse mix feed, though in truth Sarah had probably spilled more grain than she managed to scatter. Ezekiel chuckled softly and crouched down to hug them both. They were a welcome ray of light in the brisk morning, their small arms around his neck fortifying him for the busy day ahead. Ezekiel led his children into the warm kitchen for a moment and asked the cook for a couple of leftover Johnny cakes from the earlier breakfast preparation. The cook, a stout woman named Bessie, obliged with a smile, shooing the children affectionately when they thanked her in unison. Handing the sweet cornbread cakes to Jacob and Sarah, Ezekiel reminded them to stay in the yard where he or someone from the kitchen could see them. "You mind your sister now," he gently instructed Jacob while straightening the boy's collar. "Both of you stay close. Don't go running off beyond the quarters, you hear?" The children nodded vigorously. This was a familiar rule. They knew better than to wander far, especially when the big house was abuzz with important visitors. There were too many dangers: the nearby river, the occasional roaming wild dog, and though left unspoken, the unpredictable temper of young Master Preston. For most of the morning, things went according to plan. The colonel's planter guests arrived around noon by carriage, and Ezekiel oversaw their reception. He stood by silently as Colonel Caldwell
greeted them with hearty handshakes on the porch and brought them inside. Soon, the dining room was filled with the deep voices of white men discussing crop yields and the upcoming winter, punctuated by clinking utensils and satisfied hums of appreciation for the meal. Ezekiel moved like a specter at the colonel's shoulder, refilling glasses, clearing soup bowls, and summoning the next course with a discreet gesture to the waiting maid in the doorway. The luncheon was a success. He could tell by the jovial tone the men had taken on by the time dessert and coffee were served. Colonel Caldwell was in high spirits, regaling his friends with a humorous tale about a fox hunt, while Mistress Caldwell smiled thinly at the head of the table, relieved that everything was proceeding without incident. It was well past 2 o'clock, after the guests had departed and the dining room was being tidied, that Ezekiel realized he had not seen Jacob or Sarah for some time. The children usually grew bored after a while and wandered back to Rebecca or one of the other women in the quarters, but they would often return by midday, tugging at his apron for a taste of leftover pie or simply to be near their father. A faint prickle of worry stirred in his mind. Stepping out into the yard behind the kitchen, he expected to find them playing in the dirt or under the shade of the big sycamore tree. But the yard was empty now, save for a few chickens pecking at the ground and the distant figures of field hands in the rows beyond. Perhaps Rebecca had finished her chores and taken them back to the quarters for an afternoon rest, he told himself. Yes, that must be it. Still, Ezekiel felt a slight unease as he removed his white serving gloves and tucked them into his belt. He was about to head toward the quarters to check when a shout cut through the stillness. Hannah, one of the housemaids, came running from around the side of the mansion, her eyes wide with alarm. "Fire! There's a fire in the old barn," she cried, pointing frantically toward the west end of the property. Ezekiel's heart lurched. The old barn, a rickety, mostly unused structure at the edge of a fallow field, was a place his children occasionally played hide-and-seek or chased each other around. Every muscle in Ezekiel's body tensed at once, a sudden certainty gripping him that Jacob and Sarah were there, that something was terribly wrong. He took off at a dead sprint before Hannah had even finished speaking, feet pounding the dirt path that led past the slave quarters toward the abandoned barn. As he ran, others joined the alarm. Field workers dropped their tools and started yelling for water. A couple of men lugged wooden buckets, racing behind Ezekiel. With each frantic stride, Ezekiel's eyes fixed on the horizon, where a column of thick black smoke was beginning to spiral into the clear blue sky. His lungs burned, whether from sprinting or from the dread constricting his chest, he could not tell. Rounding a bend, he came upon the old barn. Flames were already licking out between the wooden slats of its walls, and dark smoke billowed upward, carrying with it the bitter smell of burning hay and old timber. A few slaves were already there, throwing buckets of water uselessly at the inferno or beating at the flames with wet sacks. The fire roared with a hungry intensity, having found plenty of dry wood and straw to devour. And then Ezekiel heard it, the sound that would haunt his nightmares for years to come, the unmistakable, high-pitched scream of a child from inside the barn. "Papa, help!" It was Jacob's voice, crying out in terror and pain, muffled by the crackling of the fire. The scream was soon joined by another, smaller voice, shrieking in fear, "Little Sarah!" They were alive, trapped somewhere within that burning hell. Ezekiel's vision tunneled. He surged forward toward the barn's wide doors, but strong arms seized him before he could get far. Matthew, the blacksmith, had dropped his bucket and grabbed Ezekiel around the chest. "No, Zeke," Matthew shouted, struggling to hold the frantic father back. "You can't go in there. You'll burn up." Ezekiel fought him with a strength fueled by pure desperation. "My babies are in there," he screamed, an animal-like roar that scarcely sounded human. He thrashed, nearly breaking free, but then two more men rushed over, each grasping an arm. Together they dragged Ezekiel backward, away from the intense wall of heat radiating from the barn. He kicked and writhed, tears of rage and panic streaming down his face. From the corner of his eye, Ezekiel saw a figure dart past him with a sudden wail. Rebecca. She had arrived on the scene, drawn by the smoke and screams. The sight of the burning barn and the realization of what was inside it propelled her into a frenzy. Before anyone could stop her, Rebecca threw aside the arm of a slave who tried to bar her way and ran straight toward the inferno, calling out, "Jacob! Sarah!" Her voice was raw with anguish. "Rebecca, no!" Ezekiel shouted after his wife, his voice cracking. He renewed his struggle against the men restraining him, but he was outnumbered, and they held fast, determined not to let another person perish. Rebecca disappeared through the open doorway of the barn, swallowed by a curtain of thick smoke. For a few seconds, nothing could be seen but the raging orange of the flames. Those seconds stretched out like an eternity. Ezekiel's heart felt as if it would burst. "God, please, please," found himself praying hoarsely, trembling in Matthew's grip. Suddenly, part of the barn's roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a shower of embers and sparks into the sky. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers as the structure sagged inward, timbers collapsing. The screams from inside abruptly ceased. The only sounds remaining were the roar of the fire and the crack of wood as the barn was consumed. When the last flames finally died down to embers some 2 hours later, a group of men, faces smeared with soot and eyes red-rimmed from smoke and tears, cautiously entered the charred ruins. Ezekiel, despite being nearly numb with shock, insisted on being among them. The interior of the barn was unrecognizable, a blackened skeleton of what it had been. The air was thick with heat and the stench of burned wood and other things. In a corner beneath a collapsed beam and a pile of ash, they found them. Rebecca's arms were wrapped tightly around Jacob and Sarah, as if her final act had been to shield her children from the flames. Perhaps she had succeeded in reaching them before the end. The three bodies were burned almost beyond recognition, huddled together in one fused mass of char and heartbreak. Yet Ezekiel knew them. A father's heart knows, even when the eyes cannot. He fell to his knees, a keen moan rising from the depths of his being. It was a sound not quite human, the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. The days that followed passed in a haze of grief for Ezekiel. Rebecca's and the children's remains were buried in 3 small graves on a grassy knoll behind the slave quarters, in the area allotted as the slave burying ground. There was no proper funeral, only a brief gathering at dusk where an elderly preacher from a neighboring plantation murmured prayers over the mounds of fresh earth. Many of the slaves wept openly, sharing in the sorrow for a mother and 2 young innocents gone too soon. Even some of the overseers kept a respectful distance, softening their voices and whips for a time out of a grudging respect for such a tragedy. Colonel Caldwell, for his part, was furious, not at the loss of life, for in his calculus, slaves, even valuable ones like Ezekiel's family, could be replaced, but at the inconvenience and loss of property. The barn itself had been mostly empty, used just for old tools and hay, but it was a structure on his land, and it had burned without his permission or any clear reason. An investigation was demanded. Could a stray spark from a smoker's pipe have started it? Had some slaves been sneaking into the barn to cook or to tryst and accidentally set a fire? The official conclusion, published in the local newspaper, was that it was a tragic accident, likely the result of carelessness by the very victims themselves, children playing with matches, as one article speculated. This story was repeated often over the next week, as if saying it enough times would make it true and absolve the plantation authorities of any further scrutiny. Preston Caldwell was notably absent during the immediate chaos of the fire. He only appeared an hour later, riding up on his bay stallion with an expression of feigned shock. He offered a plausible reason for his absence. He claimed he had been out for an afternoon ride to survey a distant part of the property and had only just noticed the smoke from afar. Breathlessly, he expressed condolences to his father about the unfortunate loss of valuable property and life. Ezekiel was nearby when Preston murmured to Colonel Caldwell that perhaps the children themselves had accidentally caused the blaze during play. Preston's face was a perfect mask of concern, but Ezekiel sensed something was off, a slight tremor in the young man's hand, a gleam in his pale eyes that seemed almost satisfied. It was 3 days after the fire when a quiet revelation shattered whatever remained of Ezekiel's world. The lunchtime work was done, and a sullen rain pattered on the kitchen yard's hard-packed earth, keeping most people indoors. Ezekiel sat on the step of his now empty cabin, Rebecca's favorite shawl clenched in his hands, staring at nothing. He had barely spoken or eaten since the tragedy, functioning on autopilot to complete his chores, and then retreating to this hollow shell that used to be his home. That afternoon, a small figure approached through the drizzle. It was Noah, a lanky 12-year-old stable boy with serious eyes far older than his years. Noah often helped tend the horses, and had sometimes tagged along after Jacob in boyish adventures. Noah glanced around to make sure they were alone, then whispered, "Uncle Zeke, I need to tell you something." His voice quavered. In his hand he nervously twirled a frayed straw hat. Ezekiel looked at him dully. He didn't trust his voice enough to speak, so he just nodded once, encouraging the boy to go on. Taking a shaky breath, Noah stepped closer. I saw Master Preston that day, by the old barn." Each word came out with great effort, as if they were heavy stones he was laying down. "It was before the fire, maybe late morning. I was fetching water from the well by the south field, and I saw him talking to Jacob and Sarah by the barn." Ezekiel's heart gave a single heavy thud. He turned slowly to face Noah, the rain dribbling off his brow. The boy's eyes darted, fearful of being overheard, but he pressed on, voice barely above a breath. "Master Preston. He was smiling at them, sir. I thought it was odd, 'cause he's never usually kind to y'all's kids. I heard him say he had a surprise game for them inside the barn. Jacob looked happy, he was always up for games. Sarah was shy, but she followed her brother." Noah swallowed hard, tears mingling with the raindrops on his cheeks. I didn't think nothing too bad, figured maybe he had some candy or was gonna tell him a story. But then I saw Master Preston go into the barn after them and shut the door. He had a padlock. I saw him put it through the latch. A cold, leaden weight settled in Ezekiel's stomach. His mind wanted to reject what he was hearing, but he forced himself to listen, his eyes boring into Noah's. "I was too far to shout," Noah continued, voice cracking. "And then I smelled smoke. By the time I realized, the fire it went up so fast. I ran to get help, but by then Miss Hannah was already yelling." Noah's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have run straight there. I should have tried to open the door." Ezekiel gently reached out and grasped the boy's shoulder, steadying him. His own hands were trembling, but his grip was firm as a vice. "It's not your fault, Noah," he said quietly, hearing the words as if someone else were speaking them. A strange calm had settled over Ezekiel, an icy clarity that cut through the fog of sorrow. "You did nothing wrong, son. You didn't light that fire." Noah sniffled and wiped his nose on his sleeve. He leaned in, whispering with fierce, angry eyes, "I hate him, Uncle Zeke. I seen him hurt others before. Someone's got to tell the sheriff. Tell the colonel." At that, Ezekiel slowly shook his head. A bitter smile twisted his lips, surprising even himself. "And say what? That a slave boy saw the master's son burn down a building and murder 2 children?" He kept his voice low and measured, though inside his chest a fire of fury was now igniting, hotter and far more controlled than the chaotic blaze that had taken his family. "They'd whip you for lying, Noah. Or worse, they'd never believe it, or they wouldn't care. Master Preston will get away with this, with all of it." Noah's face fell, the hopeless truth of Ezekiel's words sinking in. He bit his lip hard. "It ain't right," he muttered, anger and helplessness warring in his young eyes. "No, it isn't," Ezekiel agreed softly. He realized he was still clutching Rebecca's shawl in one hand. Rain had darkened the blue fabric, making it heavy. He loosened his grip, and the soaked cloth slumped to the ground like discarded skin. "Thank you for telling me, Noah. You were brave to do so. But you must not speak of this to anyone else, do you understand? Not a soul." The boy hesitated, then nodded. Ezekiel pulled him into a brief hug, patting the back of his head reassuringly. He could feel Noah's heart hammering against his ribs. "Go on now," Ezekiel murmured, "and be careful." Once Noah slunk away into the drizzle, Ezekiel sat back on the wooden step. The rain had stopped. and a weak sunbeam broke through the clouds, illuminating the barn ruins in the distance, a black scar on the green and golden landscape. Something had changed within Ezekiel as he listened to Noah's account. The grief was still there, a vast ocean of it, but now it churned with a new current. Where there had been despair, a cold purpose now flowed. Preston Caldwell had murdered Jacob, Sarah, and Rebecca. There was no doubt in Ezekiel's mind, and Colonel Caldwell had effectively covered it up, whether out of genuine belief in his son's innocence or willful avoidance of scandal. They think we'll just cry and then go back to picking cotton as usual, Ezekiel thought, a terrifying lucidity sharpening his mind. They think we'll suffer and forget. Ezekiel realized he had been wrong all along. His family's safety had always been an illusion. They were never truly safe, not when their lives could be snuffed out on a young master's whim as easily as pinching out a candle. All of Colonel Caldwell's small mercies now appeared to him as nothing more than tactics to make the slaves believe they had something to lose so they would remain docile. But Ezekiel had nothing left to lose now. Not a wife, not children, not even his faith that the world had some natural justice. The only thing he had left was the faint spark of that concept, justice, but one he would have to create with his own hands. That night, Ezekiel did not sleep. He sat in the darkness of his cabin, the hearth cold and empty. On the floor beside him lay a small wooden horse Jacob had carved with his father's help, one of its legs broken off. In the corner, a rag doll Rebecca had sewn for Sarah stared with button eyes from a shelf. These simple remnants of a life that had been warm and full just days ago now felt like artifacts of an existence that had crumbled to ash. As the midnight hours crept on, Ezekiel made a decision. It formed not as a burst of fury, but as a clear, resolute understanding. He would not remain silent. He would not remain passive. The God that the preachers told them to trust, the justice that was always promised in the afterlife, he could no longer wait for those uncertain mercies. Justice must be served in this life, he thought, each word etching itself like steel in his mind. And he now knew who would serve it, he himself. In the silence, Ezekiel whispered the names of his beloved ones like a vow. Rebecca, Jacob, Sarah. Each name was a steady beat of a drum in his ears. He then did something he had never done before, something only a free man ought to do. He chose a surname for himself. In the darkness he spoke it aloud, tasting the forbidden act of self-naming. Ezekiel Washington. He had once heard whispers of President George Washington, a man who fought for freedom, though ironically a slave owner himself. It was the boldness of taking that name that appealed to Ezekiel, like claiming a piece of the liberty that had been denied to him and his family. He had been reborn as Ezekiel Washington, a new man forged in the fire of loss, owing nothing to the Caldwells or any other master. From that moment on, Ezekiel thought of himself by that full name. He did not announce this to anyone, not yet, but he rolled it in his mind like a hot coal, letting it fuel him. When dawn came, he emerged from his cabin and resumed his duties in the big house as if in a trance. Those who knew him well noticed something was different, but they attributed it to grief. His wife and children were gone. Of course, Ezekiel would not be the same. Samuel, the plantation's blacksmith, and one of Ezekiel's closest friends, tried to speak with him one evening by the well, offering faltering words of comfort and tentative suggestions that in time God might bless him with another family. Ezekiel only nodded politely, not trusting himself to speak what was truly on his mind. How could he explain to anyone what he intended to do? Best they not know, best no one ever know until it was over. Colonel Caldwell quietly took satisfaction in Ezekiel's subdued demeanor. The colonel even called Ezekiel to his study one afternoon and offered a perfunctory condolence, masked as a stern lecture about the unpredictability of life. "I know you've suffered a loss, Ezekiel," he had said, not unkindly, "but you have to trust that Providence has a plan. Best thing now is to keep busy. My household needs you more than ever." Ezekiel had stood there, head bowed, uttering words of agreement, all the while concealing the silent storm raging within him, a plan for justice. In reality, Ezekiel Washington was keeping busy in ways the colonel could not imagine. Each night, after the lights in the big house were extinguished and the Caldwells slept, Ezekiel used the hours of darkness for his own secret purposes. At first, his tasks were small and subtle. He began to take careful stock of the estate's layout, as if seeing it anew, not as a servant, but as a tactician. He noted the structure of the manor house, the heavy oak front doors, and the delicate glass of the parlor windows, the second-floor balcony that wrapped around the house, and the narrow servant staircases at the back. He observed the daily rhythms of the household with a strategist's eye, the times when the family took their meals, when the patrolling night watchman, a burly overseer who walked the grounds, usually passed by the house, when the family retired, and when they rose. Details he had once absorbed only to perform his duties now took on new significance, piece by piece assembling themselves into a plan within his mind. Ezekiel also started gathering materials, inconspicuously and gradually. Bellwood plantation had ample stores of goods for domestic and farm use, including what Ezekiel was interested in: lamp oil, tools, nails, and rope. A bottle of oil would occasionally be left unaccounted for in the shed that stocked fuel for lamps and lanterns. Ezekiel made sure those miscounts happened and quietly stashed the spare bottles in a hidden spot under the floorboards of an old smokehouse that was seldom used. A coil of rope with a frayed end was due to be discarded by the stable master. Ezekiel volunteered to take it off his hands and then secreted it away. A hammer and a handful of long iron nails went missing from the tool bench in the carriage house one windy night. No one thought twice about it, assuming they had blown into the grass and would turn up eventually. During these nights of preparation, Ezekiel found that his grief, instead of overwhelming him, seemed to fuel a calm determination. In the daytime, he still cried silent tears into Rebecca's shawl when alone, and he spoke softly to his children's graves whenever he could slip away to visit them. But at night, as he worked in secret, he felt a grim purpose driving him on, whispering in his ear that every step he took was bringing him closer to justice. Vengeance, some might call it, but in his heart he felt it as justice, a balancing of scales that had been grotesquely skewed. One moonless midnight, Ezekiel made his way to the charred ruin of the old barn, the site of his family's demise. It was a dangerous pilgrimage. If caught, he would have no easy explanation for being there. But something compelled him. In the darkness, the blackened timbers jutted from the ground like skeletal fingers. The air still smelled faintly of soot, even after heavy rains. Ezekiel knelt in the center of the ruin, exactly where he had found his loved one's remains. He placed his palm on the cold, damp earth. The ashes had long since been washed or blown away, but in his mind's eye he saw Rebecca's face, Jacob's eager grin, Sarah's shy smile. "I won't forget," he whispered, the words trembling with devotion and fury. "I won't ever forget, and I won't forgive." He remained there for hours, through the darkest part of the night, until the first hint of dawn crept into the sky and he had to sneak back before the plantation woke. That night at the barn solidified his resolve. His plan, which had been coalescing like a gathering storm, now took on a sharper focus. He knew he wanted to destroy the Caldwells as utterly as they had destroyed his family. And the symbol of the Caldwells' power, their pride and joy, was that grand mansion house, Bellwood's very heart. If he could reduce it to the same charred emptiness as this barn, with the family inside, it would be a reckoning that even the blind eyes of official justice could not ignore. In the weeks that followed, Ezekiel refined his plan with meticulous attention. He identified all possible exits from the house: the main doors at the front and back, the French windows in the parlor that opened onto the garden, the kitchen door, and the second-floor gallery doors. On a pretext of weatherproofing for the winter, he managed to spend time inspecting many of these openings. With the help of a ladder and another servant, who thought they were just doing routine maintenance, he shuttered several seldom-used upstairs windows and nailed them shut under the guise of keeping out cold drafts. For the ground floor, he oiled the hinges of certain doors so they would swing shut smoothly and quietly when needed, and he discreetly tested the locks on others. He found that the main entry had a heavy iron key, one which hung on a hook in the colonel's study. It would be easy enough to borrow it at the right moment. He thought carefully about the other servants and slaves who would be present in the house on the night he envisioned for his revenge. They were people he cared about: Bessie the cook, Hannah the maid, young Noah serving drinks perhaps, and a few hired white attendants from town who often helped during big events. Ezekiel resolved that none of them should be hurt. He began laying plans to minimize their presence indoors when it was time to act. Perhaps he would contrive to have Bessie and the kitchen staff busy in the detached cookhouse rather than the main building. Maybe he'd send one of the footmen to fetch more wine from the cellar, and another to check on the stables just at the crucial moment. He practiced giving casual, authoritative-sounding orders to his fellow servants, the kind that would not raise suspicion even if they were unusual. In the days before his intended strike, he quietly established a pattern of taking on extra tasks himself, gaining Mistress Caldwell's trust and letting him handle things personally. If on the night of a gathering he insisted, "I'll attend to this myself, ma'am," she would likely think it part of his conscientious character, not a red flag. A particularly important discovery came while cleaning the gun room one afternoon. The colonel insisted his firearms displayed in the study be gleaming for show. Ezekiel found a small cask of gunpowder, kept for the task of reloading shotgun shells and clearing old tree stumps on the property. It was half full and tucked away on a high shelf. Ezekiel carefully took a flask and filled it with a measure of the fine black powder. Gunpowder would be the perfect catalyst to ensure the flames spread rapidly when the time came. He also pocketed a box of extra-long matches used for lighting the fireplaces. These could be hidden on his person the night of the planned conflagration without notice. Sometimes, in the dead of night as he lay awake, Ezekiel marveled at how clearly he could envision every step of what he intended to do. It was as if the act was already done, and he was merely a man walking a path fate had laid out before him.
The voices of doubt and fear that might have plagued another person in his situation were astonishingly quiet within him. Perhaps it was because in truth he had been prepared to die from the moment he held his children's lifeless bodies in his arms. Ezekiel's life as it had been was over. What walked and talked and planned now was something different, a man shaped by loss into a weapon. If carrying out his mission cost him his own life, it was a price he was willing to pay, but he would not fail. He refused to even entertain the notion. Too much had been taken from him, and now it was his turn to take what he could from those who had destroyed his world. And then fate handed Ezekiel the perfect opportunity on a silver platter. News spread in November that Colonel Caldwell's only daughter, Annabelle, had become engaged to Sylvester Thompson, the son of a prominent planter family from a neighboring county. The Caldwells decided to host an engagement celebration at Bellwood near the end of the year, an intimate family gathering that would double as a grand New Year's Eve party. The event would bring together the extended Caldwell clan and the groom's family, along with a handful of close friends. The house staff buzzed with preparations and gossip. Such an event meant the finest of everything: new curtains sewn, extra help hired to cook and serve, the best china and crystal brought out of storage. Mistress Marjorie Caldwell was thrown into a frenzy of planning, determined to outdo any party Natchez or Vicksburg had seen in years. Colonel Caldwell, though not a man prone to sentimentality, was proud of his daughter's advantageous match and eager to impress his future in-laws. The plantation bustled like an overturned anthill with cleaning, decorating, and special orders arriving by riverboat. French champagne, silks for new ball gowns, even a set of fireworks scheduled to be lit at midnight to ring in the new year with style. To Ezekiel, it was uncanny how well this aligned with his own intentions. In one stroke, he could strike down not only the Caldwells but several other pillars of the slaveholding class gathered under their roof. 17 people under one roof. He calculated from snippets of conversations, the entire Caldwell family, plus the Thompsons, the groom's parents and siblings, plus a few other relatives and close friends, all gathered, all confident in their dominion, all utterly unsuspecting that the servant hovering behind them with a tray and a bow had long since ceased to be their loyal subject. They would eat, drink, and make merry under his watchful eye, never guessing that the same keen mind which ensured their glasses were full was calculating something far more deadly. Ezekiel fine-tuned his preparations in accordance with the upcoming celebration. He began storing additional lamp oil near the mansion Undercroft days beforehand. He double-checked the rope setup at the back door and found a way to loop it quickly around the handles when the moment came. He laid a trail of gunpowder in a discreet path along the baseboards of a hallway and under a parlor rug, careful to cover it with just enough dust and carpet fringe to hide it from view. He also stashed some oil-soaked rags in nooks behind furniture and curtains where they would hasten the spread of flames once lit. Every element was designed to work in concert when he struck. The house would become a death trap in minutes, giving the revelers little chance to mount an effective escape. On the surface, Ezekiel remained the picture of a diligent servant throughout all this. If he moved with a slight urgency in his step, or if his eyes gleamed too brightly whenever the party was discussed, the whites around him chalked it up to his eagerness to please and make the night a success. Secretly, the other enslaved workers at Bellwood were proud of how expertly Ezekiel seemed to be handling the great event despite his personal tragedy. They thought it a sign of his resilience and loyalty. Some of his closest friends worried quietly that he was burying his pain in work and that he might break down later, but no one suspected the real reason he could throw himself into these tasks with such single-minded focus. And so, beneath the cheery bustle of engagement party preparations, the stringing of garlands and polishing of dance floors, Ezekiel Washington moved like a ghost with a single purpose. Each cheerful task he performed for the Caldwells was laced with double meaning. When he helped hang festive holly above the doors, he noted how a nail could be driven deeper later to secure that door shut. When he climbed a ladder to dust the hanging oil lamps in the hall, he imagined how easily those lamps could fall and shatter, their fuel feeding a blaze. As he laid out polished glass lanterns on the veranda for ambient lighting, he took mental note of how many there were and where the extra oil was stored. He smiled and nodded when Mistress Caldwell fussed about the arrangement of the evergreen wreaths, even as he thought only of how the pine boughs might catch fire like kindling. The night of retribution, the end of December, arrived, and with it the long-anticipated celebration. The grand engagement ball was scheduled for New Year's Eve of 1852, to carry the Caldwell family, and all their unsuspecting guests, into a new year they would never see. By the morning of December 31st, Bellwood Plantation was in a state of excited final preparation. Carriages bearing the first guests, the groom's family, the Thompsons, along with a few out-of-town relatives, had already arrived the day before and settled into guest rooms. More visitors from neighboring plantations were expected throughout the day. The mansion had been cleaned to perfection, its halls decorated with winter berries, ribbons, and evergreen, its larder stocked with fine delicacies for the feast. The air crackled with anticipation, as bright and sharp as the frost on the ground that morning. Ezekiel was calm. He went about his duties dressed in his neat butler's uniform, directing servants to and fro as needed, answering endless trivial questions from Mistress Caldwell and her sister, who had come to help host. Yes, the wine is properly chilled. Yes, the good linens have been pressed. No, ma'am, "There is no need to worry, everything is under control." If anyone had looked closely, they might have seen that his usual gentle demeanor had taken on an eerie serenity, as if nothing could perturb him, but the whites were too absorbed in their own roles to scrutinize the help. To them, Ezekiel was simply a well-trained servant, doing what he was supposed to do, make their grand night run smoothly. As evening fell, the guests gathered in their finery. The women wore silk and satin gowns, the men donned tailcoats and polished boots. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the parlors. A string quartet hired from Natchez tuned their instruments in a corner of the ballroom. Colonel Caldwell moved from group to group, playing the jovial host, while Mistress Caldwell fussed over minor details like a wrinkle in a tablecloth, or the spacing of the dessert plates. Annabelle, the bride-to-be, glowed with happiness and youthful vanity, accepting compliments on her lace gown and her diamond engagement ring. Her fiancé, Charles Thompson, stood at her side, chest puffed out in pride. The guest list included the Caldwell family, Colonel Caldwell, Marjorie, Preston, and Annabelle, the Thompsons, the groom Charles, his father Colonel Wilfred Thompson, his mother Elizabeth, and his teenage sister Margaret, two of Colonel Caldwell's married sisters and their husbands, Judge Harper, a close friend of Caldwell's, and his wife, and Major Whitfield, an aging planter neighbor, along with a pair of wealthy business associates from Vicksburg and their wives. All told, including a couple of older children who were playing upstairs with a nursemaid, about 15 white souls were present in the house that night. 15 people who had benefited, directly or indirectly, from the system that had destroyed Ezekiel's family. Dinner was a lavish affair. A long dining table nearly groaned under the weight of roasted pheasant, glazed ham, oysters brought by river from New Orleans, turtle soup spiked with sherry, and an array of side dishes and desserts that showcased the region's bounty and the Caldwell's wealth. Ezekiel oversaw every course with exacting precision. He poured the wine, he directed the footman when to bring out each dish, he anticipated every need of the guests with a quiet efficiency that drew nods of approval from the colonel. Several of the guests complimented Colonel Caldwell on his well-trained staff and the excellence of the service, to which the colonel replied with a gracious, "I'm fortunate to have such good people." Ezekiel only bowed his head at that, hiding the flicker of contempt in his eyes. Finally, dinner gave way to dancing and merriment. The furniture was cleared from the largest parlor to create a makeshift ballroom. Music filled the air, waltzes and reels tempting the guests to twirl and laugh. The younger folk, including Annabelle and her fiancé Charles, were eager to dance, while some of the older attendees were content to gather around the punch bowl or sit in the card room for friendly gambling. Colonel Caldwell circled among the men, puffing a cigar and beaming with patriarchal pride. Mistress Caldwell stationed herself near the musicians, commenting on the lovely choice of tunes. Preston Caldwell had been uncharacteristically quiet during dinner, perhaps bored by the domestic focus on his sister's engagement. Now he slunk along the edges of the rooms, sipping brandy and eyeing the lights of the fireworks that had been set up outside for later. He seemed restless, as if even this celebration held little joy for him beyond whatever petty cruelties he might still manage to inflict on the servants scurrying about. Midnight drew closer. The plan was to pause the festivities just before 12 for a toast to the new year and to the engaged couple, followed by the fireworks display on the lawn. The fireworks, several large rockets and a series of Roman candles, had been arranged at a safe distance from the house that afternoon by one of the overseers, under Preston's supervision. Preston had taken great interest in the explosives, perhaps imagining how impressed the ladies would be by the colorful show he'd orchestrated. Ezekiel was aware that the fireworks could complicate his own timing. If everyone stepped outside to watch, they might not be trapped inside the house when his fire started. But he had a solution. Most would likely watch from the open doors and windows, given the cold weather, rather than venturing fully out into the chill. And with a bit of maneuvering, he could ensure some key doors closed at the critical moment. As the clock in the hall showed 11:45, Ezekiel quietly slipped away under the pretense of fetching more champagne from the pantry. In truth, he was making his final preparations. He ducked into a small storage alcove under the main staircase, where earlier that day he had hidden several crucial items: the flask of gunpowder, the stacks of oil-soaked rags, and the coil of rope. Working quickly by the flicker of a single candle stub, he tied the rope around the handles of the back door and a heavy iron hook in the wall, creating a loop that, when pulled taut, would jam the door shut from outside. He left it slack for now. He would pull it tight at the last moment after ensuring no servants were left in the house. Next, he moved room to room, unseen by the revelers. In the library, a side room seldom used during parties, he uncorked his flask and poured a thin line of gunpowder along the base of a curtain and across a Persian rug. He knew he could ignite this trail later, and it would race along, spreading fire swiftly to the draperies and furniture. He placed bundles of the oil-soaked rags behind a sofa in the hallway, and at the foot of the heavy velvet drapes that adorned the front windows. Each bundle was hidden from plain sight, but positioned to ignite quickly when touched by flame. The air was heavy with the scent of pine boughs, spiced punch, and candle wax from the decorations and lighting. A slight whiff of lamp oil from his hidden rags did not stand out amid the festive aromas. With preparations in place, Ezekiel took a moment in the shadows to steady himself. He reached into his pocket and felt the folded piece of paper he had prepared earlier that day. The note was short and clear, written in his own steady, hard-earned script. For Rebecca, Jacob, and Sarah, justice is finally served. Ezekiel Washington. He had pondered those words all week, deciding on the exact phrasing. It echoed the message carved into his heart. He planned to leave this note where it would be found, a final testimony to the truth, no matter what became of him. The grandfather clock in the foyer began to strike 12, each resonant chime cutting through the din. A cheer went up among the guests as Colonel Caldwell raised his glass for the New Year's toast. It was time. Ezekiel glided back into the main ballroom with a fresh bottle of champagne just as the colonel began to speak. Everyone's attention was on the colonel's genial words. He congratulated Annabelle and Charles on their union, wished prosperity and health to all in the coming year, and extolled the hope that our southern way of life be blessed for many years to come. Glasses were raised, and at the stroke of midnight, the first distant pop of a rocket exploding above the lawn caused a few to gasp in delight and drift toward the windows for a better look. Now, under the cover of the guests' oohs and ahs at the blooming fireworks outside, Ezekiel set his plan in motion. In the confusion of half the crowd distracted by the display, and others still giggling and sipping champagne, he slipped to the side of the ballroom and quietly shut the French doors that had been opened to the lawn, securing their latch. A few guests nearby noticed only enough to assume the wind had blown the doors partway closed, and the butler was simply adjusting them. The music had paused for the toast. The only sounds were the whistling cracks of rockets and bursts of colored light visible through the glass panes. In the kitchen doorway, Bessie and two maids had paused their work to watch the fireworks, wiping flowery hands on their aprons and smiling at the rare treat. Ezekiel approached them calmly. "Mrs. Bessie," he said respectfully, leaning in to be heard over the intermittent bangs, "the second-course dishes haven't been cleared from the dining room. Would you kindly see to that before the colonel notices?" It was an unusual request. Normally lower servants would handle it, not the cook herself, but Bessie was a stickler for propriety and immediately hustled off, scolding the maids to hurry with her. As Ezekiel anticipated, her pride in her kitchen overcame any curiosity about the fireworks. She and the younger women disappeared toward the dining room, leaving the ground floor mostly free of house slaves, save for Ezekiel himself and one footman who was in the pantry fetching a new punch bowl. Ezekiel found that footman, a boy of 16 named Caleb, and touched his shoulder. "Caleb, the gentlemen in the study have requested more brandy." Ezekiel lied smoothly, pressing a ring of keys into the boy's hand. "Fetch a decanter from the wine cellar, please, and be quick." Caleb, eager to please, and slightly tipsy from sneaking sips of leftover champagne, nodded and hurried off down the corridor toward the cellar steps. Within minutes, Ezekiel had deftly cleared the lower floor of all his people. Most of the guests, engrossed by the fireworks or their own conversations, did not notice the quiet choreography of exits he had directed. It was a testament to how much trust the Caldwells placed in him that no one questioned why the servants were suddenly scarce. Perhaps they thought he had given them leave to enjoy the spectacle for a moment. Preston Caldwell, however, stirred restlessly near the foyer. Perhaps he sensed something amiss. Perhaps some latent predator's instinct pricked the back of his mind. He set down his empty brandy glass and scanned the room, his gaze eventually catching sight of Ezekiel emerging from the pantry with a taper candle in hand. Their eyes met briefly. In that instant, Ezekiel realized Preston might suspect something, if not the full scope, at least that Zeke was not behaving quite as expected. Preston's cold gray eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth as if to speak, or perhaps to shout an order.
Ezekiel did not give him the chance. With the tiniest nod of acknowledgement, almost like a polite bow from across the room, Ezekiel struck the long match he carried and touched it to the gunpowder trail he'd laid behind the library door. Thump! A fierce whoosh of igniting powder caught like a line of lightning along the base of the wall. In an instant, a curtain of flame roared up the side of the library doorway, and the fine silk drapes hanging there were ablaze. Shouts of alarm erupted as the sudden firelight and heat drew everyone's attention. The fireworks outside were forgotten. Cries of "Fire, fire" replaced laughter. Judge Harper bellowed hoarsely for water, overturning his chair as he stood. Colonel Caldwell's voice could be heard shouting, "Everyone out now." The blaze from the library doorway had leapt to the garlands and ribbons adorning the hallway walls, turning the pretty decorations into streaks of fire. Within seconds, the festive winter greenery crackled and flared, spreading the fire further along the corridor. Ezekiel was already on the move. He darted into the foyer, where panicked guests were beginning to converge in confusion. With swift purpose, he snatched the heavy iron key from its hook by the coat rack, the key to the main front doors. In the chaos, no one noticed this small act. Ezekiel pushed his way through a knot of screaming partygoers and slipped out onto the front porch, closing the massive doors behind him. With a decisive turn of the key, he locked the main entrance from the outside and pocketed the key, effectively sealing the primary escape road. At the same moment, a maid on the side porch tried to fling open the back door to call for help, only to find it wouldn't budge. Ezekiel's rope held it tightly shut from the outside. Another guest attempted to kick out a ground floor window, but the ornamental wrought iron grills outside those windows turned aside his boot. By the time he found a heavy stool to throw, smoke was choking the breath from his lungs. Inside the mansion, pandemonium reigned. The genteel gathering dissolved into a terrified mob in seconds. Flames, fed by the oil-soaked rags Ezekiel had planted, and by the lavish draperies and evergreen swags, spread with shocking speed from room to room. The pleasant warmth of many candles and fireplaces was overwhelmed by searing heat that warped the air. Thick, acrid smoke curled along the ceiling and began to descend, turning each frantic breath into a trial of coughing. Colonel Caldwell, still near the ballroom, grabbed his wife's arm and pushed her ahead of him, trying to shepherd her toward the entry hall. "The door! Get to the door!" he shouted. They reached it only to find the great double doors were inexplicably stuck. The colonel rattled the handles and slammed his shoulder against one, to no avail. "It's locked! Why is it locked?" he yelled, bewildered and furious. Nearby, Major Whitfield, the elderly neighbor, fell to his knees, overcome by a bout of violent coughing. One of the Caldwell sisters tried to help him up, but she herself was disoriented by smoke and fear. The major's wig caught a spark, perhaps from a falling ember, and within moments his head was engulfed in flames. He shrieked and stumbled blindly, collapsing in a heap as others shrank away from the sudden human torch. Preston had avoided the initial rush toward the main door. Instead, he staggered through the thickening smoke back into the dining room, perhaps thinking to escape via the side servant's door. There he found flames already crawling up the tablecloths and licking at the wallpaper. With a curse, he retreated, only to slip on a patch of spilled punch and crash to the floor. As he struggled to rise, a flaming timber from the ceiling, weakened by the hungry fire, gave way and fell directly across his lower back with a sickening crack. Preston let out a scream of pure agony. The heavy beam pinned him to the hardwood floor, and he clawed at it uselessly, his fine coat and trousers smoldering where the embers touched them. By now the house was an inferno. Annabelle and her fiancé Charles had fled up the staircase to the second floor along with a few others, hoping to escape the heat and flames rising from below. They ran to a front bedroom window that overlooked the porch roof. Charles threw a chair through the glass, shattering it, and sucked in the cool night air that rushed in. "Help! Help us!" he shouted into the darkness. Annabelle, standing beside him, screamed in terror, waving one arm frantically. A couple of servants outside heard and ran to fetch a ladder, but it was far too late for a rescue from that window. The flames behind the couple exploded out into the room as the open window drew them like a chimney. With a roar, the fire consumed the curtains, and then the floor beneath Annabelle's feet gave way. She plunged through it with a horrified cry, disappearing into the blaze below. Charles tried to catch her, but only grabbed empty air. He made a desperate move to leap out of the window, but the porch roof he hoped to land on was already on fire and collapsing. He fell in a rain of burning shingles and debris, landing in a broken heap on the ground amid flaming timbers. Outside, Ezekiel stood at a safe distance in the front yard, hood pulled low over his face. The guests' fine carriages, still hitched to teams of horses, cast long, flickering shadows as the flames danced in their wide, frightened eyes. A few hired coachmen and field slaves had gathered, but the heat drove them back whenever they tried to approach the house. They could do little but watch in horror. Ezekiel felt no urge to join them or to feign distress. He stood apart, halfway behind the trunk of a great oak, watching his handiwork unfold. The mansion was fully aflame now, a giant bonfire silhouetted against the night. The new year had arrived in a fury of fire and vengeance. Through the red glow he could see figures thrashing behind the windows, their silhouettes frantic. One silhouette caught his eye in particular, a man by the front door, pounding weakly at the wood. When the light of the flames flared at the right angle, Ezekiel recognized Preston's ash-smeared face through the small glass pane, contorted with pain, one side of it already blistering from burns. Preston Caldwell's eyes met Ezekiel's through that narrow window beside the door. In them Ezekiel saw a flicker of comprehension. In his final moments, Preston understood exactly who had done this and why. His expression was a mix of terror and a plea, a silent, desperate plea for mercy, for help. His lips moved, perhaps begging, but no sound emerged through the crackle of the fire. Ezekiel stepped closer to the door, close enough to feel the immense heat radiating from it. He regarded Preston without emotion. On the other side of the glass, flames had crawled up Preston's legs, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. Ezekiel watched as the young man who had once smirked while harming innocents now quivered and shrieked like a trapped animal, eyes bulging in unspeakable agony. There would be no mercy, not tonight. A section of the porch roof collapsed behind Ezekiel with a crash, sending sparks shooting upward. He took a step back, finally turning away from the door as Preston's screams abruptly ceased and his outstretched hand slipped down out of view. All around, people had begun to arrive from neighboring properties, drawn by the glow and thunder of the conflagration. Some were local farmers, others slaves from nearby plantations. They stood at a wary distance, horrified and fascinated by the sight of one of the grandest houses in the county being devoured by fire. A few of Colonel Caldwell's overseers, who had been carousing in the slave quarters and thus survived, now barked orders to form bucket lines, to no real effect. The fire was far beyond control. Ezekiel knew it was time to leave. With the chaos and crowds growing, his window for slipping away unseen was closing. He carefully unpinned the note he had written and nailed it to the trunk of the old oak at the entrance gate, where it would surely be seen by whoever investigated the aftermath. The paper fluttered slightly in the heat updraft, its message inked in bold strokes: for Rebecca, Jacob, and Sarah, justice is finally served. Ezekiel Washington. Pulling his cloak tightly around himself, Ezekiel retreated down a side path, away from the gathering throng and into the concealing darkness of the cotton fields. He moved quickly but without panic. His careful planning had not ended with the fire. He had mapped an escape route in advance. Beyond the fields lay a strip of woods and swamp hugging the Mississippi River. There, in a hollowed log, he had hidden a small pack of supplies, a change of coarse clothes, some dried food, and a water skin. He retrieved these and continued on until Bellwood was out of sight. Only then did he pause atop a gentle rise to look back one last time. Bellwood Plantation's great house was a collapsing, incandescent skeleton. The tall columns that once stood so proud were charred and crumbling. With a resounding crash, the roof caved in completely, sending a plume of sparks skyward as if the fire were making its own final toast to the heavens. The Mississippi River, visible as a sliver of black under the moonlight, reflected the inferno's glow in shimmering ribbons of orange and red. As the fire raged, thick smoke mixed with the cool night fog, casting an eerie pall. From some angles, it seemed as though the river itself ran black under the cloud of ash, as if mourning the souls lost that night, or perhaps conspiring to hide Ezekiel's escape. He allowed himself a final whisper, a prayer or a declaration. He wasn't sure. It is done. Then Ezekiel Washington turned and vanished into the woods, leaving behind the blazing plantation and stepping into the darkness of an uncertain future. Aftermath and legacy. By the time the first frantic rescuers managed to break down the smoldering front door in the pre-dawn hours of January 7th, 1853, it was far too late. Dawn found the once proud mansion of Bellwood a smoking ruin. Its grand columns toppled, the interior collapsed into glowing embers. Of the people who had been inside, none remained alive. Those who hadn't succumbed to the flames perished from smoke or falling debris. The 3 children who had been upstairs with the nursemaid survived only by sheer luck. The section of the house they were in collapsed in such a way that a pocket formed under some debris, shielding them from flames until a slave named Joshua, braving the heat, crawled in and pulled them out through a side window. Those little ones, a Thompson boy and Judge Harper's young niece among them, were the only survivors of the night, found dazed and coughing in the arms of their savior outside. The nursemaid herself did not survive. She had used her own body to cover the children as the building fell apart, and by the time help reached them, she was gone. 15 charred bodies were eventually recovered from the ruins and laid out under sheets in a somber row. Colonel Thaddeus Caldwell was identified by the heavy gold signet ring fused to the finger of one burned corpse near where the front door had been. Marjorie Caldwell was found only a few steps away from him, her arms wrapped around the remains of the colonel's prized family Bible, a final reflex perhaps, clinging to salvation. Judge Harper and his wife were discovered in the parlor. Their bodies collapsed together as if she had been trying to lead him out when the ceiling fell on them. Major Whitfield's body, or what was left of it, was found near the dining room, recognizable by the metal hip brace he wore. The 2 Caldwell sisters and their husbands lay not far from the main doors, so close to escaping yet trapped by the locked exit. Preston Caldwell's remains were found near the threshold, pinned under a massive beam. Those who saw his body shuddered. Even in death, his face was twisted in a ghastly rictus of terror, the agony of his last moments etched permanently into his expression. Annabelle Caldwell's body was recovered at the base of the collapsed staircase, her once white ball gown now a tattered blackened shroud. Charles Thompson, her fiancé, was found outside where he had fallen from the window, his back broken and body badly burned. As the stunned and grieving local folks tried to make sense of the carnage, the county sheriff Patrick Lambert arrived with a handful of deputies. Sheriff Lambert was a stout, no-nonsense man who had dealt with murders and accidents before, but nothing on this scale. He initially assumed a terrible accident had occurred, perhaps a stray ember from a fireplace igniting decorations. But as he surveyed the scene more closely, certain details didn't fit the narrative of an accident. Why were the front doors locked from inside? They had to hack through them with axes, only to find the deadbolt slid in place. And the rope tied tightly around the back door handles. What was that about? It looked deliberate. Survivors from the slave quarters told the sheriff about the unusually rapid spread of the fire, mentioning that flames seemed to burst out in multiple places at once. To Lambert, an experienced lawman, it sounded more like arson than chance. The most damning evidence, however, was discovered by a deputy near the main gate. Nailed to the great oak that framed the entrance was a half-scorched piece of paper. Despite a corner being singed, the message scrawled on it was still perfectly legible. The deputy who found it read it twice, as his hands began to shake, then wordlessly brought it to Sheriff Lambert. Lambert read the note, his eyes widening in disbelief, and then narrowing in anger. He read it aloud for those gathered. For Rebecca, Jacob, and Sarah, justice is finally served. Ezekiel Washington. A hush fell over the crowd of onlookers. Many of the slaves present gasped or covered their mouths. They knew those names: Rebecca, Jacob, and Sarah, Ezekiel's wife and children.
The accidental barn fire that had killed them suddenly took on a new, sinister context. And Ezekiel Washington, some of the field hands exchanged glances. They knew only one Ezekiel, and he was the butler. Why Washington? Was that meant to be him? "It's Ezekiel," whispered one of the housemaids who had survived. "He did this." Her voice held a mix of awe and horror. Sheriff Lambert pocketed the note with a grim set to his jaw. He immediately organized a posse. Messengers were sent on horseback to neighboring counties and to riverboat landings with descriptions of Ezekiel. Light brown complexion, tall, lean, burn scar on left forearm, about 32 years of age, answers to Ezekiel, may call himself Ezekiel Washington. A reward of $1,000 was posted for his capture, dead or alive. The dead or alive need not have been said, it was understood. The region was in an uproar. In all the years of slavery in Mississippi, there had never been such a dramatic and complete act of slave revenge recorded. A single slave had allegedly annihilated one of the wealthiest families and their friends in one night of wrath. The remains of the victims were gathered, and over the next few days, interred in a somber mass funeral. The local church was draped in black crepe. Ministers thundered about divine judgment, and also warned of the evils of abolitionist propaganda infecting our loyal slaves. Many of the white mourners at Colonel Caldwell's funeral carried not just handkerchiefs but pistols, their eyes flitting about as if expecting Ezekiel to leap from the shadows and attack them too. Fear mixed with grief and outrage. For the enslaved people of the county, the aftermath was twofold. On one hand, Ezekiel's name became a legend almost overnight. In the quarters, when out of earshot of overseers, slaves whispered about how one of us had delivered justice that Massa's law never would. Some said he had become like Samson from the Bible, pulling down the pillars and killing the Philistines in one grand act of vengeance. Others said he was more like Moses' angel of death, visiting retribution on the firstborn of the oppressors. His bold adoption of the surname Washington particularly struck them. The first president's name, a symbol of freedom twisted in a new way. It was audacious, defiant. On the other hand, fear gripped the slave quarters too, for they knew well the pattern that one person's rebellion often brought many people's punishment. In the days immediately following, slave owners all across the region tightened the reins harshly. Dogs sniffed through slave cabins at random, looking for stolen goods or incriminating evidence of plots. Curfews were imposed and strictly enforced with the whip. The state militia was even called out to patrol the roads for a time, ostensibly searching for Ezekiel, but also sending an unmistakable message to all slaves: do not dare follow in his footsteps. Rumors spread that in some neighboring county several slaves were lynched simply because their master found rags and oil in their cabins, and feared they were planning arson too. Paranoia among the slaveholders was at fever pitch. Ezekiel Washington's actual whereabouts remained a mystery. Possemen followed a trail of footprints and some torn fabric into the swamp near the river, but the track eventually vanished at the water's edge. It was speculated he might have boarded a raft or hidden on a barge heading north. One riverboat captain claimed a deckhand saw a lone man swimming across the river the night of the fire, but in the darkness it was impossible to be sure of his identity. There were reports in the weeks after that a man resembling Ezekiel was spotted in Memphis, trying to buy passage on a steamer heading up to Cincinnati. Another claimed he was seen much later, in the spring of 1853, in a small town in Ohio, alive and well, going by a different name and working as a blacksmith. There was even a fantastical story that he made it all the way to Canada, and from there wrote a letter back to someone in Mississippi. This letter was never produced by anyone reputable. Despite the massive reward and the intense manhunt, Ezekiel Washington was never captured. It was as if he had melted into the night itself. Over time, the sightings became more legend than fact. Some swore he died in the swamps that winter, taken by alligators or drowning. Others were convinced he joined the Underground Railroad network and lived out his days helping other fugitives to freedom. And a few, especially among the local black populace, liked to think he was still alive for many years afterward, a free man somewhere who got away with everything. In the immediate wake, however, what he left behind was undeniably significant. Bellwood Plantation itself never recovered. With no direct heirs aside from distant relatives too afraid to claim the cursed property, the estate went into legal limbo. The charred rubble of the mansion was eventually cleared, and the land was parceled off by creditors. But locals avoided the place, deeming it haunted ground. People claimed that on the anniversary of the fire, the night air around the old Bellwood site would become warmer, and a faint sound of music and screams could be heard on the wind. A couple of superstitious travelers even reported seeing ghostly figures dancing in the field where the house once stood, only for the figures to burst into flame and vanish. The area took on the nickname Black River Bend, a morbid twist on how the Mississippi had run black with ash that night. For the slaveholding class of the South, the night the river ran black became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones over glasses of whiskey. It highlighted their greatest fear, that those they oppressed so brutally might one day rise up and exact revenge. In the past, they had Nat Turner's Rebellion, where several dozen whites were killed by revolting slaves in 1831, to haunt their dreams, but that was a faraway thing in Virginia and was quashed by the militia. This, however, happened right in their backyard in Mississippi, and what's more, it wasn't a whole uprising of hundreds of slaves. It was one man, One single man had dealt a blow no army of slaves ever had, and then disappeared like a ghost. The psychological impact was profound. Many masters stopped allowing their slaves to learn any skilled trades that involved fire or tools, fearing it would make them too dangerous. Cooks, those who handled poisons and flames every day, were watched with renewed suspicion, or even replaced by white hires in some households. Butler positions, which required intelligence and autonomy, were increasingly filled by older trusted slaves or not at all. The perceived lesson was to keep the enslaved as ignorant and closely controlled as possible. But that, ironically, only underscored to the enslaved just how terrified their masters truly were. Among black folk, whether enslaved or free, the story of Ezekiel Washington was kept alive in whispers and sometimes in song. A secret work song made the rounds in cotton fields across Mississippi in the years that followed. Its lyrics were couched in enough biblical metaphor to pass by overseers' ears without immediate suspicion, but those in the know understood the references. Oh, the river ran black on a New Year's night, justice came howlin' in a blaze so bright, Pharaoh's house burned with Pharaoh inside, and the angel of vengeance took his fiery ride. Go down, Ezekiel, way down in Mississippi's land. Tell ol' master's gonna shake their burnin' hand. One slave alone he faced the tyrant's throne, set fire to the mansion, and freed his soul to roam. These lines and variations of them were sung low and with a fierce pride when out of the white man's earshot. To many enslaved people, Ezekiel became a folk hero, not because they all wanted to follow his path of violence, most knew it would mean doom to even try, but because he represented the possibility of agency in a world that told them they had none. He had done the unthinkable. He punished those who were thought untouchable. Over the following decade, as the nation hurtled toward civil war, abolitionists in the North would occasionally reference the Bellwood Massacre, spinning it as a sign of the moral degradation slavery inflicted on everyone. Pro-slavery voices, on the other hand, used it as propaganda to stoke fear, arguing that freeing slaves would lead to widespread murder and arson. In either case, Ezekiel Washington's name entered the annals of American lore as both a caution and a rallying cry. And what of Ezekiel himself? In the absence of confirmed facts, a mythology grew. Some said that he lived to see the Civil War and even volunteered with a Union regiment under an alias, so he could fight openly against the slaveholders. Others imagined he made it to Liberia, the colony in Africa established for former slaves, and started a new life there. A less romantic version held that he likely died of exposure or illness in the wilderness shortly after fleeing, and only the legend of his escape persisted. Perhaps the most fitting legacy is the one that took root on the very soil of Bellwood. The land where the plantation stood eventually turned to wilderness, and then in the 20th century was partially reclaimed as a historical site. Locals swear that on cold winter nights, especially around the New Year, the place grows unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Some claim to have seen a lone figure walking along the old overgrown drive, a lantern in hand. He's described as tall and lean, with eyes that gleam like embers. When approached, he supposedly tips his hat, and then vanishes. They call him the Ghost of Black River Bend. Of course, these are just ghost stories, or are they? In the end, Ezekiel Washington's story remains one of the most disturbing and complex episodes in Southern history. In a single night, he transformed a scene of celebration into a scene of judgment. His act was one of personal revenge, yes, but it was also a statement that even the most oppressed person could, under extreme circumstances, become the instrument of reckoning. He forced those who heard of his deed to confront uncomfortable questions. Was he a monster for burning people alive, or was he an avenging angel delivering justice long overdue? Were his victims simply innocent bystanders, or were they complicit in an evil system and thus reaping what they had sown? Ezekiel himself likely did not care how others would judge his actions. In his mind, justice had been served, in the only way it could be when the laws protected the guilty and not the innocent. He had lost everything that mattered to him, and in return he took everything he could from those responsible. He balanced the scales in a brutal, fiery fashion that ensured no one would ever forget. Today, more than 170 years later, the tale of the night the river ran black still has the power to send shivers down the spine. It reminds us that the past is not just a sepia-toned story of gentlemen and ladies on plantations. It is also the story of those who suffered under them and the extremes to which they could be driven. In Ezekiel's flames we see a reflection of all the voices that were silenced, all the justice denied, suddenly roaring to life, undeniable and devastating. If this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, it's because Ezekiel Washington's act still resonates as a stark warning and a haunting legacy. The walls of official history books might not dwell on episodes like this, but these are the stories that linger in the folk memory, in the places where it happened, passed down in murmurs and cautionary rhymes. Thank you for watching and walking with us through this shadowed chapter of history. If this tale moved or intrigued you, please give this video a like and share it with others who seek out the hidden truths of the past. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that official history preferred to forget. And now we want to hear from you. Do you believe Ezekiel Washington found the freedom and justice he sought in the end? Was his act justified as the only way to right a terrible wrong? Or do you think it crossed the line between justice and vengeance? History doesn't offer easy answers to such questions, but it leaves us stories like this one, stories of pain and retribution, of oppression and defiance, and of a man who decided that some injustices are too great to be forgiven, and some memories too powerful to be forgotten. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember, the past may be gone, but its echoes, even the darkest of them, still shape our world. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay tuned for more tales from the shadows of history.